Hello, it's Devin, the free range author here. Last week I gave you the introduction to my Patreon page, and then I read you the introduction to Wanderling's Choice. I meant to go ahead and read every chapter a day, but we had some computer issues. I think I've got this fixed. I'm sure you're eager for me to get back to reading, as am I. So let's, without any further ado, get into it. Wanderling's Choice. Chapter 1. Falcon. Ree has turned into such a pretty young thing, hasn't she? I don't think there's another girl, rich or poor, around here half as beautiful as she. You must be so proud of her, their neighbor was saying. She and Brody are going to make such pretty babies when they get married. Rihanna nearly dropped her basket of laundry. With an effort, she forced herself to continue with her chore, being careful to keep the sheets between them so no one would know she had been listening. Brody was their neighbor's son down the lane. Reedy had known him since they were both toddlers. They had been playmates all through their childhood. She liked him plenty, but not like that. He seemed more like one of her brothers. How could they possibly think they were lovers? Yes, they will, if he would just hurry up and ask her. She's getting rather old. Just imagine a 17-year-old lass that's unmarried. Another couple of years and people will start calling her an old maid, her mother replied, and the two older women laughed like hens clucking over some juicy tidbit. Ree emptied her basket of laundry as quickly as she could, and then hurried around the corner of the chicken shed and sat down. She felt like an old horse who had galloped up a very steep hill. Her chest was tight and it was hard to breathe. How dare they? Was all she could think. She had no idea people thought of her in this manner. Here she was, barely an adult, and everyone already had her life all planned out for her. The last thing Ree wanted was to live her life according to everyone's preconceived expectations. No one had ever asked her what she wanted. She didn't even like Brody, not in the romantic sense at least. How dare they? Ree pulled herself to her feet and staggered over to the nearest paddock fence. She stared out at the scene before her. Bessie, the family cow, grazed contentedly on the long grass as it waved in the wind, while the cow's calf gamboled beside her mother in the summer sun. Such a sight had always made Ree feel free and happy before. Now she felt like the paddock rails were holding more than Bessie and the calf. The fence caged Ree as well. I know what you're thinking. Ree jumped in fright as her younger sister's voice piped up from her elbow. You're dreaming of Brody, aren't you? Ree's eyes narrowed and she frowned. Not even close, she growled in a low voice. She spun on her heel and stalked away. This was how it had all started. Her parents were planning on marrying her off to Brody. No one asked her. It was just assumed it would happen. But Ree wanted more, so much more than marriage and children. Her mother had dowry money set aside for each of the girls when they got married. She had stashed it in a large tin, kept high in the eaves of the house, with their names on each. The next morning, Ree awoke before the rest of her family stirred, took her dowry money, and headed down the road away from the farm. Her family used this road to go to market, but she wasn't going to market. She instead went to the horse fair 3 miles in the other direction. The horse fair happened every 7 days. It was held on top of a hill called Stallion's Bluff. People came from far and wide to buy and sell horses of all sizes and types. Ree had loved coming here as a child. But that was a long time ago, and Ree knew that the difference now between a cart horse and a plow horse, a work horse and a merchant horse, or a messenger horse. She could also tell the difference between a good buy and a slick deal. Ree walked through the gates and took a moment to catch her breath and take in all the sights. There were horses everywhere and people wheeling and dealing. The air was thick with the smell of manure and fresh hay and the squeals and neighs of frightened or excited horses. The first thing Ree noticed wasn't a particular horse, but a man, a small, thin man, leaning up against a carriage. He was dressed all in brown and green and wore a great floppy hat on his head. His face was weather-beaten and lined, so his age was difficult to guess. He seemed to be much older than Ree. He smiled at her from a mouth a bit too wide, and his eyes looked old and sad. His sad eyes sparkled at her. Sweeping his great hat off his head, he bowed and nodded a greeting to her. A man then led 2 great dray horses between them, and when Ree looked again, he was gone from sight as if he had never been. Well, that was odd, she thought to herself. And then she shook the memory out of her head. In the next moment, she had forgotten all about it. She continued on in her search. It seemed to Ree that she must have spoken to every horse dealer there. They all knew of her family and tried to sell her an old plow horse, no matter how much she told them she didn't want a workhorse. Frustrated and steamed because the day had turned hot, she sat down on a stump in the sun, since all the shade was taken, to eat her meager lunch. Suddenly her bench was shielded by a welcoming, cool shadow. She looked up to see the man who had first nodded to her. He had removed his great floppy hat and was holding it out to shade her, revealing his lank blonde hair. "Pardon me, lass, but it's too hot a day for a miss as pretty as you to eat in the sun," he said. His accent was one she had never heard before. "The horses need the shade more, but I thank you for your kind offer," she replied. "Did you not think to bring anything to drink?" he had asked. "No," she laughed. "I remembered food, but I forgot drink. How silly of me." He smiled and held out a flask. "It's just water. I do not drink alcohol. People tend to do stupid things when they drink." Ree hesitated. He was a stranger and a horse dealer. They had a murky reputation. But it was so hot. She muttered her thanks and took a shy swig from the stranger's flask. It was simple water and nothing more, but it was ice cold. She took a more daring gulp. The stranger pulled up another log to sit beside her. "How is your search for that perfect horse going?" he inquired pleasantly. With a roll of her eyes, she told him. "They all want to sell me cart and plow horses." He laughed in sympathy. "Too many dealers here think that a pretty face such as yours cannot possibly be a good judge of horseflesh. I don't want the perfect horse, just a good using horse." He nodded. "And just what is your definition of a good using horse?" Ree sighed and thought a bit. "Well, nothing so big that I need a ladder to get on. Nothing too short. Not a plow horse, or a cart horse, or a work horse." "Ah," he breathed in comprehension. "You want a riding horse." "Yes," Ree agreed. "I don't care about the color, although something not so fancy as attracts enough attention to get stolen, but something not downright ugly would be good, too. Something not too flighty, with a good, smart mind, something with a good turn of speed, something tough and hardy for rough terrain and weather, something that can get by on little food and without shoes, something like a good merchant or messenger horse, maybe even a light war horse, whose brain hasn't been ruined by his experience. You know, a good using horse." The man laughed at her. "Well, you don't want much, do you, lass? Just the perfect horse." Ree's face fell. She felt like she had been slapped. No, don't misunderstand me. I'm not laughing at you. It just so happens I have 6 horses, and one particular special one that might fit the description." Ree looked at him with hope and then suspicion. "Lass, if I was trying to hustle you, that flask would not have mere water in it." Ree chewed on her last bite of bread slowly and thoughtfully as she looked him up and down. "Finish your meal, and I will show you my stock." She wrapped up the remainders of her meal and replaced them in her satchel and got to her feet. "But I think I've seen every horse here on Stallion's Bluff," Ray said. "Oh, but you haven't seen my stock," he assured her. "I keep them off the bluff and in a private grove until I think I have a potential buyer. Just follow me." Her inner senses began to whisper a warning in her ear. He wanted her to follow him off the bluff, far away from the other people, to a secluded area. What about this sounded trustworthy? But follow him she did, off the bluff, into the wooded hillside, into a small private glen. She followed at a distance, making sure she had enough space between them if she needed to make a quick retreat. They rounded a corner of the wood and came to a small paddock. "Here they are, my pretties, my beauties. Aren't they wonderful?" Ree came to a sudden stop and her jaw dropped. 6 of the loveliest horses she had ever clapped eyes on stood in the paddock. They were all groomed within an inch of their lives, and their coats gleamed like metal. Their legs were clean and blemish-free, their bare hoofs solid and healthy. Their well-chiseled faces looked at her with a quiet intelligence. They're beautiful," she gasped. "Of course they are. I know my horseflesh, and I take good care of them. But these horses are not for you." She had to give it a moment to let the words sink in before she realized she had lost sight of the strange little thin man. "Here is your perfect horse, lass." He spoke softly, and he was suddenly standing right beside her. He held the reins of a magnificent coppery chestnut stallion. His mane was long and thick and silky, and his coat was soft as down and shiny as a penny. The eyes which met hers were intelligent and soulful. When Ree touched his face, he lowered his head and breathed softly into her hands. He snorted and shook his head, revealing a small white mark on his forehead, which looked like wings. "I've readjusted the stirrups. They should be the right length for your legs. Why don't you take 'em for a test ride, lass?" Almost in a dream, Ree found herself putting a foot in the stirrup and bounding unaided into the saddle. The stallion waited until she settled herself and her skirts around his sides. Then he breathed softly and began to move as if she cued him with her mind. His walking steps were confident and smooth, making her sit deep into the saddle. He arched his neck proudly and slid into an effortless trot. They trotted an elegant figure-8 formation. She almost startled when she heard the man call out to her, "The lassie has a good seat." They did 2 more figure-8s, and the stallion did just as he was bid. "Does he move like a plow horse?" She gave a trembling giggle. Heavens, no. She chanced to look up to the horse dealer. He was beaming at her. "Why don't you see what a real gallop feels like?" She could feel the stallion underneath her hesitate, just as she was hesitating. Then he pulled gently, quietly on the reins, as if to say, "Please, may I?" She turned to him to face the steep slope of the bluff, leaned forward over his neck, lessened her grip on the reins. At the same time, she hissed in his ear and gave his sides a gentle rap with her heels. And the stallion exploded underneath her. With a bellow and a leap, his great hooves attacked the earth of the hill. Rhea was startled just for a moment. She found his great lunge hadn't dislodged her, and they were still together. She clung like a tick and felt the power roll out of him from beneath her. He was strong and fast, faster than any horse she had ever thrown a leg over, in his prime and full of himself. And yet he was still right there with her. He hadn't left her behind. What a horse! He slowed his mad dash the minute she thought about it and easily came back to a slower pace. Rhea loved this horse, and she felt he liked her and would have done anything to please her. She had to have him. But now she was now sure she didn't have enough money to purchase him, not on a farmer's dowry. She chewed her lip as she thought about this. The horse dealer was grinning ear to ear as she rode up to him. "Well, that was certainly a sight, no mistake. You move as one. He is the perfect mount for you." Rhea nodded and grudgingly pulled out her small purse, which she was now sure held not enough coin to purchase such an animal. "How much?" she muttered. For the first time he touched her. The little man grabbed her hand to stop her. "No, this horse is not for sale for gold." Rhea gave him a confused look. What racket was he trying to pull? "Yes, you can buy this horse, but not for money." His hand had released hers, and it was now resting on the skirts over her leg. Rhea's eyes flew wide as another option became clear to her. It seemed to dawn on the horse trader as well, because suddenly he let go of her, and holding both hands up into the air, he backed away from both horse and rider. "Now, don't mistake me, lass. I never meant that." Rhea's frown deepened. "Then what do you mean? Speak plainly. So far you've only spoken in riddles." He laughed and waggled his head. "Yes, I can see where you came up with this idea." He sighed heavily. "It's like this. I'm not a horse trader. I'm a horse matcher. I match the correct horse with the correct person. I do not accept money for this. I accept tokens." Rhea pursed her lips. "Tokens? What sort of tokens?" "Name him. This horse has had other riders and other names. They were all wrong. Find the correct name for this animal, and you will prove to me that you belong together." This was the oddest arrangement that Rhea had ever heard of, and yet it somehow made sense to her. So she thought. She thought about the mad dash up the hill and how perfectly suited they seemed to be for one another. She thought about how beautiful he was and how he seemed to fly. She thought about the white marking on his head. She looked up into the sky. A bird was circling them slowly overhead. It cried out, the keen of a bird of prey. It flapped its wings, and as the wings fluttered, a single feather dislodged and drifted, spinning its slow spirals to the earth. Without thinking, Rhea positioned the horse underneath the fluttering feather. She caught it and examined it closely. It was the same glossy red color as her horse. "Falcon," she whispered for the first time, and then spoke louder. "His name is Falcon." The man smiled, nodded, and walked up to her. Silently, he removed the feather from her hands. He stroked the feather lovingly, smoothing down its parted sections. "We have an accord. The stallion is yours, milady. His name is Falcon." He placed the feather in his great floppy hat and graced her with another sweep and a bow, and suddenly he was gone. He just disappeared right before her eyes. So did his paddock and the other 6 horses, again as if they had never been. But the great red chestnut stallion Falcon was still beneath her. Rhea had found her horse. Rhea and Falcon cantered the rest of the day and most of the night. She didn't care where she was headed. She just picked a direction the road seemed to be going and took it. She rode until her seat grew sore and Falcon grew damp underneath her. Then she remembered she better take care of her horse and slowed him to a walk. They walked for 3 miles until Falcon had stopped panting and the sweat had dried on him. Her head began to nod. She decided she had better rest both of them, but she didn't want to bed down right at the side of the road. She pushed steadily onward until she heard a stream bordering their way. Her tired eyes searched for a proper place, and soon she found a small clearing on the other side of the stream. She guided Falcon off the road, down the embankment and across the stream. Wearily she dismounted and unsaddled Falcon. She took off her shoes and led him to the middle of the stream. As he drank his fill, she splashed the sides where the sweat had dried and scrubbed the crunchy areas with her fingers. The stream water was cold, from ice melt from the nearby mountains, but the night was warm. She had no fear of shocking his muscles. She should have made a fire and cooked some food, but she was too tired. She only had the energy to shake out her blanket, and using the saddle as a pillow, she lay down in the thick grass with Falcon grazing nearby. Nighttime was just melting into morning. Dawn was tinging the horizon with orange. She gave a heavy sigh and closed her eyes, surrendered to sleep. She awoke to sound of a crackling fire and an aroma of cooking meat. Her stomach yowled in hunger. She groaned and stretched. Her muscles complained at their bad choice of a bed. Her neck was stiff and her legs and rump sore from the ride the day before. She rose to her elbows and looked about wildly for a horse. Wouldn't it be just perfect if he had wandered off during the night? But Falcon was there beside her, his belly full of grass, swishing the flies away with his heavy tail. He looked at her, then shook his head and snorted as if to say, "You sleep too much," and then resumed grazing. The entire clearing had been cropped close of all its grass, except for the patch where she was sleeping. She stiffly rolled over and eyeballed the fire warily. Somebody had made it a good while ago, because there was already a thick bed of orange coals. It was ringed in river stones, and an iron spit had been erected over it, upon which a butchered rabbit had been skewered. She looked about suspiciously, but there was no one around. The smell of the roasting meat made her mouth water. She removed the skewered rabbit and cautiously tasted it. Somebody had taken their time preparing it. It was seasoned to perfection and cooked thoroughly and evenly. She devoured it hungrily, as if it was the best rabbit she had ever tasted. When there was nothing left but bones, she went to the stream and washed her hands and face thoroughly with a little pad of lard soap she had thought to bring with her. This done, she brushed out her long, russet locks. She returned to the fire and picked up the saddlebags. Ree rummaged through them, checking her gear and rearranging things. She had everything pulled out, but something still rattled inside the left pouch. She turned it upside down and shook it forcefully. A flash of silver and white fell out attached to a leather cord. She picked it up and examined it more closely. It was a silver medallion. There was an inscription on the back which she could not make out. Unlike most farmers' daughters, Ree could read, but she couldn't read this. The inscription seemed to dance and flutter like bright sunlight on the ripples of water in a clear pool. It dazzled and confused her eyes so much she wasn't sure what she was looking at. She flipped the medallion over in her hands. The front face held the delicate etching of a feather, nothing more, just a white feather and a disk of silver, flashing in the noonday sun. She had never seen such a token before and had no idea what it stood for or what it symbolized. "Falcon tells me you rode him hard," a heavily accented voice said from across the glade. She gasped, startled, and spun about. The horse dealer stood there, stroking the nose of the red chestnut tenderly. "He also said you took very good care of him when you stopped, before you saw to your own needs." The thin little man with the sad eyes and the floppy hat came over to sit beside her on a fallen log. "Are you following me?" Ree said. He smiled, took off his hat, and laid it on his knee. "No, my dear. The path you have chosen just happens to be the same way I'm going. Simple coincidence and nothing more. You certainly don't need me to hold your hand along the way." "And you made the roast rabbit?" she asked. He nodded. "Did you enjoy my cooking?" "Yes, I did. I guess I should have saved you some." He laughed and waved her off. "Don't worry. I have eaten already. But after a hard ride, I decided you needed some meat in your diet." Ree stabbed the campfire coals thoughtfully. She wasn't sure she wanted company right now, especially with the man who had sold her Falcon. It felt awkward somehow, like he was checking up on her and making sure she took good care of the horse. Would he renege on the sale if he thought that she didn't treat Falcon right? "So now you speak to horses. How is that possible?" she asked. He too picked up a stick and began to absently poke at the fire. "There's an old story in my family that many generations ago an elf married into my clan. Now, I'm not sure whether the elf was male or female, or even if the story is true, but the members of my family find it very easy to understand and be understood by animals. When I found out I had some sort of power of communication with horses, I stopped selling them and started matching them to the correct rider. It has been a much more fulfilling career than the one I'd had before. Ree listened to this explanation carefully, but was still doubtful. Whether or not it's better, more honest way of making a living, you still need money sometimes. I mean, I don't think you make your own clothes, except for that strange hat of yours. What do you do when you really need gold to buy something with? Oh, I have no problem getting money when I need it. You see, Rumpelstiltskin is my uncle. Ree stared at him. You are the oddest man I have ever met. And his already wide mouth split even wider in mirth. Was any of that gibberish true? He sniffed and shook his head. I don't really care whether you think it's true or not, lass. It makes for a good story, does it not? Ree sniffed. You know, you seem to be very eager to have me believe you, and believe you are an honest person in a dishonest world. But I don't think you're beyond a little petty theft now and then. He tissed at her as if disappointed. My dear, you wound me deeply, he said. His words were pained, but his expression was very amused. Now, what have I done to make you think that I'm a thief? I think you stole that tack Falcon came with, he gasped dramatically. I certainly did not. Ree just waggled a scolding finger at him. Oh, but I think you did. He shook his head in denial. Prove it, lass. Ree smiled. Fine. Then where did this come from? She held aloft the medallion on the leather cord. Suddenly the man beside her wasn't teasing anymore. His expression was one of true shock, a sheep cornered by a clever sheepdog. Where did you find that? In one of the saddlebags, as if you didn't know. Tell me you did not steal it. He took a deep breath and looked her full in the eyes. I did not steal it. Ree just held his gaze for a long moment. But you recognize it, don't you? It has an inscription on the back, but I can't read it. What does it say? He swallowed with difficulty and slowly took it from her. He turned it over and over in his hands. It's an ancient tongue that no one now can read. He stood up and slowly walked around behind her. She saw the medallion flash as he held it before her face momentarily, and then lowered it to rest against the skin of her throat. She felt him begin to tie it around her neck, and without thinking, she held her long locks out of the way. It found you, and therefore it now belongs to you. Wear it, and it will protect you in your darkest hours on the road. This is all I am permitted to tell you at the time. I give you my word on this, Rihanna. Ree sat up straight as she realized something. How did you know my name? He would not reply, yet still she could feel him standing behind her. How can I believe the word of a man whose name I don't even know? She felt rather than saw him smile. He laid his hands very gently and lightly on her shoulders. My name is Shane. Remember that. Shane. And then he let go of her. Ree spun about. He was gone. She was alone once again. The next day, Ree started her new life, a life of her choosing. All she wanted was to live life her way, to be the master of her own future. This was why she had run away from the farm, her family, and everything she had ever known. For several years, she wandered the surrounding lands during the spring and the summer. During the cold winter, she found someone to shelter her until the spring thaw. The moment the ground had softened and the weather warmed, she and Falcon would be off again, wandering the lands. Nothing was certain. She had no idea where she would sleep from one day to the next, or where her next meal would come from. And Ree found she liked it that way. No one told her what to do. No one expected her to live or behave a certain way. Only the weather, terrain, and nature ruled her. She was completely free from anyone's expectation but her own. Sometimes she would run into Shane. She might only catch a glimpse of him from a distance, and they would smile, wave to each other. Or they might share a meal and catch up on the goings-on in each other's lives. He seemed to be particularly pleased with the way she had chosen to live her life, free and independent. So her life continued, with a few bumps on the road, until the day when she decided to attend that one particular horse fair. That's all we have for today.